Ethan's doubts refused to settle, no matter how hard he tried to convince himself that everything was fine. He wanted to believe Lila. After all, they'd been married for 8 years, and she had always been honest. At least, that's what he thought. But the tension in their home was undeniable. A few days after their dinner conversation, Ethan came home early from work, hoping to surprise her. The house was unusually quiet. Lila's car was in the driveway, but when Ethan called out her name, there was no response. He found her upstairs in their bedroom, sitting cross-legged on the bed with her phone in hand. She seemed startled when she saw him. "Ethan, you're home early," she said, locking her phone quickly and setting it aside. "Thought I'd surprise you," Ethan replied, forcing a smile. "Everything okay?" "Of course," she said, her tone overly casual. "I was just texting my mom." Ethan nodded, but the nagging feeling in his chest grew stronger. Something wasn't right. He glanced at her phone, but before he could say anything more, Lila got up and kissed him on the cheek. "I'll go start dinner," she said, hurrying past him. Ethan stood there for a moment, staring at the empty doorway. Her explanation didn't sit well with him, but he told himself he was overthinking. The following weeks brought more peculiar behavior. Lila started going out more often, claiming she was meeting friends or running errands that always seemed to take longer than usual. She was distant, yet overly cheerful whenever Ethan asked about her day, as if she was trying too hard to sound normal. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Lila's phone buzzed on the coffee table. She picked it up quickly, glancing at the screen before turning it face down. "Who was that?" Ethan asked, keeping his tone light. "Just a coworker," she said, standing up abruptly. "I need to make a quick call. Be right back." She disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Ethan staring at her phone. He could hear her voice, hushed and urgent, but couldn't make out the words. His chest tightened. For the first time, the thought crossed his mind. What if she's hiding something? The turning point came one Saturday afternoon when Ethan noticed something unusual. Lila had mentioned she was meeting a friend for coffee, but an hour later, Ethan saw Ryan's truck drive past their house. It was odd. Ryan lived on the other side of town, and he rarely came around unannounced. Ethan watched from the window as Ryan parked a few houses down and got out of his truck, glancing around nervously. He walked down the street and disappeared around the corner. Ethan's heart raced. Why would Ryan be here if Lila wasn't home? And why was he acting so secretive? Determined to find answers, Ethan decided to follow Lila the next time she left the house. A week later, the opportunity presented itself. Lila told Ethan she was meeting her friend Melissa for lunch. She kissed him goodbye, but Ethan noticed her hesitation, the way she avoided meeting his eyes. As soon as she left, Ethan grabbed his keys and followed her car at a safe distance. He expected her to head to the cafe where she and Melissa usually met, but instead, she took a different route, one that led to the outskirts of town. Ethan's stomach churned as he watched her turn into the parking lot of a small, rundown motel. She parked near the entrance, stepped out of the car, and walked inside. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. He parked a block away, his mind racing. Why is she here? Who is she meeting? He waited, his heart pounding in his chest. 10 minutes later, he saw Ryan's truck pull into the motel parking lot. Ethan's blood ran cold as Ryan got out and entered the same building. It felt like a punch to the gut. The two people he trusted most were in that motel together. Ethan sat there for what felt like an eternity, his thoughts spiraling. He wanted to storm inside and demand answers, but he also knew he needed to be sure. The evidence was staring him in the face, but part of him still clung to the hope that there was some other explanation. Finally, he made up his mind. Ethan got out of his car and walked toward the motel. As he approached the building, he could feel his pulse in his ears. His hands trembled as he opened the front door and stepped inside. The receptionist barely glanced at him as he scanned the room numbers. He saw Ryan's truck parked near the back, and guessed which room they were in. Standing outside the door, Ethan hesitated. His heart was pounding so loudly that he thought they might hear it. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door. The knock on the door echoed in the stillness of the motel hallway, a sound so sharp it seemed to cut through the air. Ethan's hand, still pressed against the wooden surface, trembled as his breath hitched. He didn't know what he would see behind the door, but he couldn't turn back now. For a moment, there was no response. Then faint shuffling sounds came from the other side of the door. Hurried footsteps, whispered voices. Ethan could feel his chest tightening, his emotions a turbulent mix of anger, heartbreak, and dread. The door opened slowly, and there stood Ryan, his face pale as if all the blood had drained from it. He looked like a man who had just been caught stealing, his lips parting but no words coming out. Behind him, Lila appeared, her hair tousled, her blouse slightly wrinkled. When her eyes met Ethan's, her expression morphed from confusion to sheer panic. "Ethan," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's jaw clenched as he stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the unmade bed, the scattered clothes, the undeniable evidence of what had transpired. "You told me you were meeting Melissa," Ethan said, his voice low and shaking with restrained fury. "What the hell is going on here?" Lila opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Ryan, standing awkwardly by the bed, finally found his voice. "Ethan, this isn't what it looks like," Ryan blurted, his words tumbling over themselves in a desperate attempt to explain. "Don't," Ethan snapped, his voice rising. He turned to Lila, his eyes filled with betrayal. How long has this been going on?" Tears welled up in Lila's eyes as she stepped forward, her hands raised as if to plead. "Ethan, please let me explain." "Explain?" Ethan interrupted, his voice cracking. "What could you possibly say that would make this okay? You lied to me. Both of you." The weight of the moment was suffocating. Lila's tears spilled over as she reached for Ethan, but he stepped back, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Don't touch me," he said, his tone icy. "I trusted you. I trusted both of you. And this is what you do. In some cheap motel." Lila sobbed, her face crumpling. "Ethan, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen. It was a mistake. A mistake." Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Mistakes don't last for weeks or months. How long has it been, Lila? How long have you been sneaking around behind my back?" She hesitated, glancing at Ryan, who looked as though he wanted to disappear. Her silence was answer enough. Ethan shook his head, his heart breaking even as his anger grew. "I loved you, Lila. I gave you everything. And this is how you repay me." Ryan finally spoke up, his voice shaking. "Ethan, I'm sorry. I swear, I didn't mean to hurt you. Stop," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. He turned to Ryan, his eyes blazing with fury. "You were supposed to be my best friend. My brother. How could you do this to me?" Ryan looked down, shame written all over his face. I don't have an excuse." Ethan stared at him for a moment, his fists unclenching as he took a step back. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound he'd ever felt. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Ethan sat in his car for a long time, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He felt numb, his mind replaying the scene in the motel room over and over again. He couldn't go home, not yet. The house they had shared, the life they had built together, now felt tainted. He needed time to think, to process everything. Eventually, he drove to a nearby park, parking under the shade of an old oak tree. He sat there in silence, staring out at the empty playground. The memories of happier times with Lila flooded his mind, only to be overshadowed by the image of her standing in that motel room with Ryan. How had it come to this? That evening, Ethan returned home, his emotions still raw. The house was quiet, the emptiness amplifying his sense of loss. He found himself wandering through the rooms, his eyes landing on photos of him and Lila, smiling on their wedding day, laughing during a vacation, holding hands at a family gathering. He picked up a photo of them at the beach, the sunlight catching the joy in their eyes. The image felt like a cruel joke now, a reminder of what he thought they had but clearly didn't. Ethan sat down on the couch, the weight of the day crashing down on him. He didn't cry, he couldn't. His anger and pain were too overwhelming to allow for tears. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway jolted him from his thoughts. Moments later, the front door opened and Lila walked in. She looked as though she had been crying nonstop, her face pale and her eyes red and swollen. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Can we talk?" He didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Please," she pleaded, stepping closer. "I know I hurt you. I know I betrayed your trust. But I want to fix this. I want to make it right. Ethan finally looked up at her, his expression unreadable. You can't fix this, Lila. You broke us. And you didn't just betray me. You destroyed everything we built together. She sank to her knees in front of him, her tears falling freely. I know. And I'll do whatever it takes to make it up to you. Please, Ethan. Don't give up on us. But Ethan shook his head, his voice quiet but firm. You gave up on us the moment you chose him. The silence that followed was deafening. The next morning, Ethan awoke on the couch, his body aching from a night of restless sleep. The house was eerily silent. The usual warmth it held now replaced with a cold, oppressive stillness. He stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying the events of the previous day, like a haunting movie he couldn't turn off. Lila had stayed the night in the guest room, her soft sobs occasionally breaking the silence. Ethan had heard her, but he didn't care. Her tears meant nothing to him now. He sat up slowly, his head pounding as he tried to make sense of everything. How could he have been so blind? The woman he loved, the woman he trusted more than anyone in the world, had been sneaking around behind his back with his best friend. The betrayal was a knife that twisted deeper with every thought. By mid-morning, Ethan made his decision. He couldn't stay in the house, not while Lila was still there. He needed space to think, to breathe. Gathering a bag of clothes and essentials, he headed for the door. Lila appeared in the hallway as he was leaving, her face pale, and her eyes swollen from crying. Ethan, please, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Don't go. Let's talk about this. He paused, his hand on the doorknob. What's there to talk about, Lila? You made your choice. I made a mistake, she said, stepping closer. I know I hurt you, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I love you. Can't we try to work through this? Ethan turned to face her, his eyes filled with pain and anger. You don't destroy someone you love, Lila. You didn't just make a mistake, you made a decision. Over and over again, you chose to betray me. And now you want to work through it, because you got caught. Her lip quivered as fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. It wasn't like that. I was confused, Stop, Ethan interrupted, his voice firm. I can't do this right now. I need time to think. Without waiting for her response, he walked out the door, slamming it shut behind him. Ethan drove aimlessly for hours, his thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. Eventually, he found himself at his sister Clara's house. She had always been his rock, the one person he could turn to when life became too much. Clara opened the door, and immediately knew something was wrong. Ethan, she asked, her brow furrowing. What happened? He stepped inside, his shoulders slumping as he let out a shaky breath. It's Lila, he said, his voice breaking. She's been having an affair. Clara's eyes widened in shock. What? With who? Ryan, Ethan said bitterly, the name leaving a sour taste in his mouth. Clara's expression hardened as she led him to the couch. Tell me everything, she said, her voice steady and supportive. Ethan recounted the events of the past few weeks, from his initial suspicions to the confrontation at the motel. Clara listened intently, her anger simmering beneath the surface. I can't believe they would do this to you, she said when he finished. Lila and Ryan? That's disgusting. You don't deserve this, Ethan. He nodded, his hands gripping the edge of the couch. I don't even know what to do. I feel like my entire world just collapsed. You're stronger than you think, Clara said, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. But you need to protect yourself. Have you thought about what comes next? Ethan spent the next few days staying with Clara, avoiding Lila's calls and texts. He needed clarity, and he knew he wouldn't find it if he went back home. One afternoon, he met with a divorce lawyer recommended by Clara. Sitting in the sleek office, he felt a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a sense of finality. Infidelity is one of the leading causes of divorce, the lawyer explained. You have every right to file, and we can make sure the process is as smooth as possible. Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. I just want to move on. I don't want to drag this out. The lawyer assured him they would take care of everything, including dividing assets and ensuring a fair settlement. Ethan felt a small sense of empowerment for the first time since discovering the affair. Lila, meanwhile, was unraveling. She had tried calling Ethan countless times, leaving voicemails filled with apologies and pleas for forgiveness. When he didn't respond, She began sending long, heartfelt texts, but Ethan ignored those too. One evening, she showed up at Clara's house unannounced, tears streaming down her face. Clara answered the door, her expression icy. "Lila," she said curtly, "what are you doing here?" "I need to see Ethan," Lila said, her voice shaking. "Please, Clara. I need to talk to him." Clara crossed her arms, blocking the doorway. "He doesn't want to see you right now. And honestly, I don't blame him." Lila's shoulders slumped as she began to cry. "I made a mistake, Clara. I know I hurt him, but I love him. I just want a chance to make things right." Clara sighed, her expression softening slightly. "Lila, I don't think you understand how much damage you've done. Ethan's heartbroken. He's seeing a lawyer. You need to respect his boundaries." Lila nodded, wiping her tears. "Just tell him I'm sorry. Please." Ethan felt a strange sense of relief when Clara told him about Lila's visit. He still loved her, part of him always would, but he knew their marriage was beyond repair. The betrayal was too deep, the trust irreparably broken. He signed the divorce papers a week later, handing them over to his lawyer with a sense of finality. It was painful, but it was also necessary. Lila called him one last time after receiving the papers, her voice filled with desperation. "Ethan, please don't do this," she begged. "I'll do anything to fix this. I'll go to therapy. I'll cut all ties with Ryan, whatever it takes. Just give me another chance." Ethan's voice was calm but firm. "I've already made my decision, Lila. This isn't something we can come back from. I hope you find peace, but I need to move on." With that, he ended the call, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. Months passed, and life slowly began to take shape for Ethan in a way he hadn't expected. The immediate aftermath of the divorce was difficult, emotionally draining, and filled with moments of doubt and grief. Yet as time went on, Ethan realized he had two choices: remain tethered to the pain of betrayal, or rebuild his life from the ground up. He chose the latter. Ethan moved into a new apartment in the city, a modest but cozy space that felt like a fresh start. The house he once shared with Lila was sold as part of the divorce settlement, and though it was bittersweet to let it go, Ethan welcomed the opportunity to leave behind the memories that haunted him there. His sister Clara was his biggest supporter throughout the process, checking in on him regularly and encouraging him to embrace the change. "Maybe this is a blessing in disguise," Clara said one evening as they shared a bottle of wine on her porch. "You've got a clean slate now. You can focus on yourself, your dreams, your happiness. No baggage." Ethan chuckled softly, swirling the wine in his glass. "I can't even remember the last time I thought about what I wanted. I spent so much of my life making sure Lila was happy. I guess I lost myself somewhere along the way." "Well," Clara said with a smile, "now's your chance to find yourself again." Ethan took her advice to heart. He threw himself into work, landing a promotion at his marketing firm that kept him busy and gave him a renewed sense of purpose. He also rediscovered his love for running, something he'd given up years ago. Most mornings, he could be found jogging through the park, his headphones blasting music as he pushed himself to go farther faster. The physical activity helped clear his mind and allowed him to focus on the present instead of dwelling on the past. He also began reconnecting with old friends he had unintentionally drifted away from during his marriage. Nights out with them reminded him of who he was before everything fell apart. A man who loved to laugh, who had dreams and ambitions outside of being a husband. One evening, Ethan attended a charity event his firm was sponsoring. It was a lively gathering, filled with professionals mingling over cocktails and hors d'oeuvres. As he navigated the room, he found himself striking up a conversation with a woman named Sophie. Sophie was vibrant and witty, with a sharp sense of humor that caught Ethan off guard. They spent the evening talking and laughing, their connection effortless and natural. At the end of the night, Sophie handed Ethan her business card with a warm smile. "If you ever want to grab coffee and continue our debate on why pineapple doesn't belong on pizza, give me a call." Ethan laughed, pocketing the card. "You've got yourself a deal." For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt a spark of excitement, hope for the future. Meanwhile, Lila's life had taken a different trajectory. The fallout from the affair had left her emotionally shattered. Ryan, who had promised her the world during their clandestine meetings, had vanished shortly after Ethan filed for divorce. He claimed he couldn't handle the guilt, leaving Lila to face the consequences of their actions alone. The weight of her choices pressed heavily on her, and she found herself reflecting on the decisions that had led her to this point. Lila reached out to Ethan once more, hoping to salvage even a sliver of their former connection. But Ethan, though kind in his response, made it clear that his path no longer included her. "I hope you find peace, Lila," he said in his final message to her. "But I can't be a part of your life anymore. I need to move forward." It was the closure she needed, even if it wasn't what she wanted. Ethan's healing journey continued, and over time, the pain of betrayal began to fade. He learned to forgive, not for Lila and Ryan's sake, but for his own. Holding on to anger only kept him tethered to the past, and he was determined to let go. Months after their first meeting, Ethan and Sophie began dating. She was patient and understanding, never pushing him to move faster than he was ready. With her, Ethan rediscovered the joy of companionship and the possibility of love. One sunny afternoon, as they walked hand in hand through the park, Sophie turned to him with a smile. "You seem lighter these days. Happier?" Ethan nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "I am. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Ethan's journey wasn't without its challenges, but in the end, he emerged stronger, wiser, and more resilient. The pain of betrayal no longer defined him. Instead, it became a chapter in his story, a chapter he had closed as he embraced a brighter, more fulfilling future. The end.